Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the streets of ancient Rome, not the marble temples, triumphal parades, or heroic legends you see in movies, but the darker corners people rarely talk about. The Rome hidden behind the polished statues. The city where thousands vanished into slavery, where debt could destroy an entire family, where the poor survived beside unimaginable wealth, and where entertainment often meant watching people die for applause. Our story begins in the year 62 CE, during the reign of Emperor Nero. The summer heat hung over Rome like a damp cloak. The city smelled of smoke, fish sauce, sweat, and sewage carried through narrow streets packed with carts and shouting merchants. In the district of Subura, where crowded apartment blocks leaned dangerously over winding alleys, a young scribe named Lucius Valerius hurried through the market with wax tablets tucked under his arm. Lucius was 23, educated enough to read and write, poor enough to rent a single cramped room beneath a baker's workshop. His father had once owned a small vineyard outside the city, but debts and a bad harvest had swallowed it years ago. Now Lucius copied legal documents for money and occasionally wrote letters for illiterate laborers. That morning, he had been summoned to the house of a wealthy senator named Gaius Septimus. The senator's residence stood on the Palatine Hill, far above the noise and filth of Subura. Marble columns framed a cool courtyard with fountains and citrus trees. Slaves moved silently across mosaic floors, carrying trays of fruit and watered wine. Lucius was kept waiting near the atrium while guests discussed politics. The grain shipments from Egypt are delayed again. One man complained. Then increase the price, another replied casually. The poor will still buy bread. They always do. A ripple of laughter followed. Lucius lowered his eyes. Bread prices mattered deeply in Subura. When grain became expensive, people skipped meals. Eventually, a steward beckoned him forward. Senator Gaius Septimus wanted several contracts copied neatly before sunset. The work was straightforward, but one document caught Lucius's attention. A debt agreement transferring ownership of a debtor's children as collateral. He tried not to stare. The senator noticed his hesitation. You disapprove? Gaius asked mildly. Lucius swallowed. No, Dominus. I was only reading carefully. Good accuracy matters more than sentiment. The senator returned to his conversation, as if discussing livestock instead of children. This was one of Rome's quieter cruelties. Although outright debt slavery had officially been limited centuries earlier, desperate families still pledged children land or labor to creditors. The law had evolved, but power usually favored the wealthy. Lucius finished copying the contracts by late afternoon. Before leaving, he was paid 3 silver denarii and handed leftover bread from the kitchen, a gesture meant to appear generous. Outside the villa, he passed a chained group of captives being marched toward the slave market. Their clothing marked them as as recent arrivals from the eastern provinces, likely taken during military campaigns or sold by local officials seeking profit. A boy no older than 14 stumbled on the hill road, and the guard struck him across the shoulders with a stick. No one intervened. Rome depended on slavery so completely that many citizens barely questioned scenes like this. Enslaved people cooked meals, taught children, cleaned streets, worked mines, rowed ships, and entertained crowds. Some were treated relatively well, many were not. In the worst places, mines and large plantations especially, life expectancy could be brutally short. Lucius continued downhill toward Subura as evening shadows stretched across the city. Vendors shouted over one another. Fresh olives, cheap wine, hot lentil stew. A funeral procession squeezed past a butcher stall. Children darted between carts. Somewhere nearby, a woman screamed in anger. Then laughter erupted from a tavern. Rome felt alive, but also crowded beyond reason. Historians estimate the city held close to 1 million people at its height, making it one of the largest urban centers in the ancient world. Most residents did not live in elegant villas. They lived in tall, unstable apartment buildings called insulae, structures so cheaply built that collapses and fires were constant fears. Lucius climbed 4 narrow flights of stairs to his room. The baker below was still working, and warm air smelling of ash and dough seeped through the floorboards. He set down his tablets and counted his coins carefully. 3 denarii, enough for rent and food for a few days. Not enough to escape poverty. He ate bread dipped in watered wine and listened to the building creak around him. Through the thin wall, he could hear neighbors arguing about money. Someone mentioned a landlord raising rent after repairs to the roof. Another voice cursed tax collectors. The empire projected power and order, but daily life for ordinary Romans could be precarious. Wages were low, accidents common, and there was little safety net for illness or unemployment. Grain distributions helped some citizens survive, yet many hovered constantly on the edge of hardship. The next morning, Lucius received another assignment from Senator Gaius. This time, he was to accompany a steward to the forum and record testimony in a property dispute. The forum was Rome's beating heart. Temples, law courts, political speeches, money changers, and endless crowds. But alongside the grandeur stood beggars with missing limbs, debtors pleading with creditors, and exhausted laborers waiting for day work. During a pause in proceedings, Lucius noticed a woman kneeling beside a magistrate's platform, clutching a child. "Please," she begged, "my husband died in the quarry. We cannot pay." The magistrate barely glanced at her. "Submit the petition properly." "I cannot write." "Then hire a scribe." She laughed bitterly at that. "Hire a scribe with what money?" A guard moved her aside so officials could pass. Lucius looked away. ashamed of his own relief that he was not in her position. Education gave him a fragile advantage, but only a fragile one. A single illness or unpaid debt could drag him downward too. Later, while copying testimony beneath a shaded portico, he overheard merchants discussing conditions in the imperial quarries of Egypt and the mines of Spain. Men die there quickly, one said matter-of-factly, especially the slaves. Cheaper to replace them than improve conditions, another replied. They spoke as calmly as traders discussing livestock prices. Rome's wealth came from conquest, taxation, and massive extraction of labor. Silver mines, stone quarries, and agricultural estates generated fortunes for elites, while consuming human lives at an industrial scale for the ancient world. That evening, Senator Gaius hosted a banquet and unexpectedly ordered Lucius to stay and copy notes from political conversations. The dining room glittered with oil lamps reflected in polished silver. Guests reclined on couches, while servants poured wine from amphorae cooled in snow brought from the mountains. Course after course arrived. Dormice stuffed with herbs, oysters, roasted peacock, honey cakes. Musicians played softly in the background. Lucius stood near a pillar, writing quickly. One senator boasted about a gladiatorial show he had sponsored. 300 fighters over 5 days, he said proudly. The crowd demanded more executions at the end. Did you give them what they wanted? Someone asked. Of course, a Thracian bandit and 2 condemned murderers. Excellent spectacle. The men nodded approvingly. Public executions and gladiatorial combat were not fringe entertainment in Rome. They were central to civic life and political popularity. Emperors and elites sponsored games to gain favor with the masses. Crowds cheered for skill, bravery, and blood. Lucius had attended games before. Almost everyone had. But hearing wealthy men discuss deaths as casually as theater performances unsettled him in a way he had never admitted aloud. As the banquet wore on, conversation shifted to politics and rumors surrounding Nero. Some praised the emperor's artistic ambitions. Others mocked them carefully, glancing around before speaking. In Rome, careless words could be dangerous. Informers thrived, and accusations of disloyalty could ruin lives. Near midnight, Lucius was dismissed with another small payment. On his way out, he passed the household quarters, where dozens of slaves slept on mats in cramped rooms behind the luxurious main residence. One elderly woman was still awake, rubbing ointment onto swollen hands. Their eyes met briefly. Lucius wanted to say something kind, but he kept walking. Compassion without power often felt useless. Back in Subura, the streets were still noisy. Taverns spilled light into the alleys. Gamblers shouted over dice games. And somewhere a drunken singer bellowed an off-key love song. Yet, beneath the chaos lay constant tension. Hunger, debt, overcrowding, and the awareness that the powerful lived by different rules entirely. Lucius climbed to his room and lay awake, listening to distant dogs bark across the city. Rome called itself the center of civilization, but from where he stood, civilization looked suspiciously like survival layered over fear, and he was beginning to notice things he could no longer ignore. The next morning began with shouting in the alley below. Lucius woke before sunrise to the sound of angry voices echoing between the tall apartment buildings of Subura. He rolled from his narrow bed, crossed the room, and looked through the small window overlooking the street. A crowd had gathered around a landlord and two assistants. One of the tenants, an elderly shoemaker named Marcus, stood beside a pile of possessions that had been dumped into the mud. A stool, a blanket, a wooden chest missing one hinge. His wife sat nearby, weeping quietly. "You owe 3 months," the landlord snapped. "My son is sending money from Ostia," Marcus pleaded. "You said that last month." "He is coming. Then he can pay for another room." The assistants carried out the remaining belongings while neighbors watched. Nobody intervened. Nobody could. Most people living in Subura rented their homes. Landlords held enormous power, and eviction could happen with frightening speed. There were no modern protections, no appeals process that ordinary people could realistically afford. If rent went unpaid, families often found themselves sleeping in temples, workshops, or on the streets. Lucius watched until the crowd dispersed. Then he prepared for work. The senator's steward had ordered him to report to the forum shortly after dawn. The streets were already busy. Bakers sold fresh loaves from smoky ovens. Laborers gathered at corners hopping to be hired for construction projects. Water sellers shouted prices. Donkeys pulled overloaded carts through lanes barely wide enough for passage. As Lucius approached the forum, he noticed an unusual commotion near the temple of Castor and Pollux. Several soldiers were escorting prisoners through the square. Their hands were bound. Iron collars encircled their necks. People stepped aside as the group passed. A woman beside Lucius whispered, "Runaway slaves." Her companion shrugged. "Unlucky." The remark struck him. Unlucky. Not tragic. Not horrifying. Simply unlucky. Rome's dependence on slavery had normalized suffering to such a degree that many citizens barely considered enslaved people fully part of society. Some owners treated slaves as trusted members of a household. Others treated them as tools no different from livestock. The law generally favored the owner, and owners possessed nearly unlimited authority within their households. One of the prisoners stumbled. A soldier yanked him upright. The procession continued toward a holding facility near the market. Life moved on immediately. Merchants resumed selling goods. Lawyers resumed arguing cases. Crowds resumed bargaining. The suffering of strangers rarely interrupted the rhythm of the city for long. By mid-morning, Lucius found himself recording testimony for a dispute involving a wealthy merchant family. The case concerned inheritance, more specifically, whether several enslaved workers should be divided among heirs or sold. For hours, the participants argued over value. How much is the Syrian tutor worth? What about the cook? The physician brings a higher price. Numbers filled the discussion. Prices, profits, investments. No one asked what the individuals themselves wanted. By the time proceedings ended, Lucius felt exhausted. The steward handed him new instructions. Senator Gaius wishes you to accompany me this afternoon. Where are we going? The Aventine. Lucius nodded. The Aventine Hill contained both respectable residences and poorer districts. As they traveled south, the city gradually changed. Wealthy villas gave way to workshops, warehouses, and crowded housing. Eventually, they arrived at a large grain distribution center. A line stretched around the building. Hundreds waited patiently under the growing heat. Men, women, children, veterans, widows, laborers. Many clutched wooden tokens, proving eligibility for subsidized grain. Without these distributions, a significant portion of Rome's population would struggle to eat. The empire's prosperity depended heavily on grain shipments from provinces such as Egypt and North Africa. Any disruption could create panic. Lucius watched people stand for hours. Some had arrived before sunrise. An old veteran leaned heavily on a cane. A mother attempted to quiet two hungry children. Near the rear of the line, an argument broke out. Someone accused another man of cutting ahead. Voices rose. Pushing began. Guards intervened before violence spread. The steward shook his head. They become animals when food is involved. Lucius said nothing, because hunger had a way of stripping dignity from people. Most of those waiting were not lazy. They worked, they struggled, yet many remained one failed harvest, one injury, or one missed payment away from disaster. The dark side of Rome was not only violence, it was dependence. Millions depended upon systems they could not control. Grain routes, employers, landlords, patrons, officials. If those systems failed, ordinary lives collapsed with astonishing speed. After completing their business, Lucius began walking back towards Subura alone. The shortest route took him past one of Rome's slave markets. Normally, he avoided looking. Today, curiosity slowed his steps. Under shaded awnings, traders displayed human beings for sale. Some stood on platforms. Others waited behind wooden barriers. Signs listed age, skills, and health conditions. A young woman advertised as a household servant, a Greek teacher capable of educating wealthy children, a strong laborer suitable for construction, an elderly man offered at a lower price due to failing eyesight. Buyers examined them much, as livestock might be inspected. Questions were asked, hands were inspected, teeth checked, prices negotiated. Lucius felt uncomfortable, not because this scene was unusual, because it was ordinary. Rome's greatness rested upon countless realities that citizens preferred not to examine too closely. As he prepared to leave, he noticed a familiar face among the crowd, the elderly slave woman from Senator Gaius's household, the one whose swollen hands he had seen the previous night. She stood beside a trader. For sale. Lucius hesitated, then approached cautiously. The trader noticed. Interested? No. Then move along. The elderly woman remained silent. Her expression revealed little. Years of servitude had likely taught caution. What happened? Lucius asked quietly. The trader laughed. Owner is replacing older household workers. Replacing, as though discussing furniture. The woman never spoke. Moments later, a wealthy couple arrived. Negotiations began. Lucius walked away. There was nothing he could do, and somehow that made the experience worse. The afternoon heat intensified. Rome's streets grew louder. The smell of garbage became stronger. Despite impressive engineering achievements, sanitation remained a serious problem in many districts. Refuse accumulated in alleys. Chamber pots emptied into drains. Public latrines helped, but disease remained common. Many ancient writers praised Rome's aqueducts. Few celebrated its smells. As evening approached, Lucius stopped at a public bath. Bathhouses were among Rome's greatest social institutions. Rich and poor often visited the same facilities. People exercised, bathed, conducted business, exchanged gossip, and discussed politics. The atmosphere felt lively, almost cheerful. For a short while, it was possible to forget the harsher realities outside. Lucius entered the warm room and settled onto a stone bench. Nearby, two merchants discussed profits. A retired soldier described campaigns in Britain. An older man complained about taxes. Then the conversation shifted. A group gathered around a storyteller. Did you hear what happened in Sicily? Someone asked. No. A plantation owner lost dozens of slaves. Escape. Worse, revolt. The listeners exchanged glances. Slave revolts terrified Roman society. The memory of earlier uprisings, especially the rebellion led by Spartacus decades before, remained deeply embedded in the Roman imagination. Whenever unrest appeared, authorities responded harshly. Fear traveled both directions. Slaves feared masters. Masters feared slaves. Violence lingered beneath the surface of daily life. Later, as Lucius left the bathhouse, he noticed crowds moving toward a large amphitheater. A public spectacle was scheduled. The excitement was obvious. Vendors sold food. Children ran ahead. Friends called to one another. The atmosphere resembled a festival. Almost everyone enjoyed the games. Even people who criticized them often attended. Lucius followed the crowd. He told himself he was curious. In truth, he already knew what awaited inside. The arena filled rapidly. Thousands packed the seats. The wealthy occupied privileged positions. The poor crowded higher sections. Everyone stared toward the sand-covered floor. Trumpets sounded. The show began. At first, there were animal displays, then staged hunts. The audience cheered loudly. Blood stained the sand. Workers raked it smooth between events. Hours passed. Finally came the midday executions. The mood changed. Not quieter, more intense. Prisoners were brought forward. Some had committed serious crimes. Others were political enemies. Some may have been victims of circumstance. The crowd rarely knew the full story. The condemned were killed publicly. Many spectators applauded. Some laughed. Others looked bored. Lucius watched a man kneel in the arena. For a brief moment, the prisoner looked upward toward the enormous crowd surrounding him. Tens of thousands of eyes. Then the sentence was carried out. Cheers erupted. Lucius felt sick, yet nobody around him appeared disturbed. This was normal. This was entertainment. This was Rome. As darkness approached, the games ended. People poured into the streets, discussing favorite moments. A vendor excitedly described a particularly dramatic execution. Two young men argued about gladiator skills. Children pretended to fight with sticks. Life continued. Lucius walked home through torchlit alleys. The city buzzed with energy. Rome was magnificent. Rome was powerful. Rome was wealthy beyond imagination. But beneath every monument stood unseen labor. Behind every triumph stood suffering. And increasingly, Lucius found himself wondering whether the empire's greatest achievement was not conquest. Perhaps it was convincing millions of people that all of this was normal. That night, as he climbed the stairs to his room, he noticed a crowd gathered outside Marcus, the shoemaker's former apartment. The door stood open. People whispered nervously. Lucius pushed through for a better look. Then he froze. Marcus had been found dead, and according to the neighbors, he had died only hours after being thrown from his home. The landlord had already arrived, not to mourn, to calculate what possessions remained worth selling. And for the first time, Lucius felt something shifting inside him, because he was beginning to understand that Rome's darkest stories were not hidden in distant battlefields. They were happening every day, right outside his door. Marcus the shoemaker was buried the following morning. No grand procession followed his body. No marble monument waited beside the road. No senator delivered a speech praising his life. Only a handful of neighbors accompanied the cart, carrying his remains toward a modest burial ground outside the city. Lucius walked with them. The old man's wife moved slowly beside the wagon, supported by two women from the building. She had barely spoken since the eviction. The entire ceremony lasted less than an hour. A short prayer, a few handfuls of earth. Then everyone returned to work. In Rome, poverty rarely allowed time for grief. The dead were mourned quickly because the living still needed bread. As Lucius returned toward Subura, he found himself studying the faces around him. A mason carrying tools, a fish seller arranging her stall, a laborer limping from an old injury. Thousands of people passed each other every day without knowing how close many were to disaster. One accident, one illness, one missed payment. Sometimes that was all it took. The city itself seemed indifferent. Merchants shouted. Wagons rattled across stone streets. Temple bells echoed in the distance. Life moved forward, whether individuals survived or not. Later that afternoon, Senator Gaius summoned Lucius again. The request seemed ordinary enough. Several legal documents required copying. But when Lucius arrived at the villa, he immediately sensed tension. Servants moved more quietly than usual. The steward appeared nervous. Groups of guests whispered in corners. Something had happened. Eventually, Lucius learned the reason. A wealthy merchant connected to several influential families had been accused of fraud. Ordinarily, such accusations were not unusual. What made this case different was the amount of money involved. Entire fortunes were at stake. As Lucius worked, he overheard fragments of conversation. He bribed the inspector. No, someone betrayed him. They say witnesses disappeared. Of course they disappeared. The men laughed softly, not because the possibility was amusing, because it sounded believable. Corruption existed at every level of Roman society. Officials accepted bribes. Tax collectors skimmed profits. Judges could be influenced. Governors sometimes enriched themselves at the expense of entire provinces. Rome possessed laws, thousands of laws, but enforcement often depended upon wealth, connections, and influence. A poor man stealing bread might face severe punishment. A wealthy man stealing a fortune could sometimes purchase protection. The difference mattered. That evening, while carrying finished documents to the archive room, Lucius accidentally entered a corridor used by household slaves. The contrast was startling. Just beyond the luxurious reception halls lay cramped quarters, crowded with sleeping mats. The air felt hotter. The walls were bare. Several servants were eating a simple meal of coarse bread and beans. One young slave girl couldn't have been older than 13. She looked exhausted. Lucius apologized and turned to leave. But before he could go, an older servant spoke. "You are the scribe." Lucius nodded. The woman glanced around carefully. "Do you know where they took Flavia?" Lucius frowned. "Who?" "The old woman." Immediately he understood. The elderly servant he he had seen sold at the market. I don't know. The woman lowered her eyes. Neither spoke for a moment. Then she quietly returned to her meal. Lucius left, feeling uneasy. The wealthy residents of Rome often viewed slaves as replaceable. Yet every person removed from a household left behind relationships, friendships, memories. Lives did not simply disappear because owners wished them to. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange beyond the rooftops. For a brief moment, Rome looked beautiful. Marble temples reflected the evening light. Statues cast long shadows. The city appeared almost timeless, but appearances could be deceptive. That night, a fire broke out 3 streets from Lucius's apartment. He awoke to shouting. The smell of smoke filled the air. People rushed into the alley carrying buckets. Children cried. Neighbors scrambled down narrow staircases. Lucius joined the crowd immediately. Fire was one of Rome's greatest fears. Most apartment buildings contained wooden beams, wooden floors, wooden roofs. A single spark could destroy entire districts. The blaze had started in a workshop. Strong winds pushed flames toward neighboring structures. Men formed bucket lines. Others attempted to tear down sections of buildings to stop the spread. Chaos filled the street. For hours, the struggle continued. Finally, shortly before dawn, the fire was contained. Several buildings had been damaged. One had collapsed entirely. A young carpenter was killed. 2 others suffered severe burns. People spoke about the event throughout the next day, yet nobody seemed particularly shocked. Disasters like this occurred regularly. Ancient Rome possessed fire brigades known as the vigils, but even they could not prevent every catastrophe. For many citizens, danger was simply part of daily life. Lucius spent the following morning helping neighbors clear debris. As he worked, he spoke with a laborer named Quintus. The man had lived in Subura for nearly 20 years. "Why stay?" Lucius asked. Quintus laughed. "Where else would I go? Outside the city." "To do what?" The laborer wiped sweat from his forehead. "At least here I can find work." Lucius understood. Rome attracted people from across the empire because opportunity existed there. But opportunity often arrived alongside misery. The city offered employment. It also offered overcrowding, disease, exploitation, and uncertainty. By midday, the streets had returned to normal. As always, Rome absorbed hardship and continued moving. That afternoon, Lucius received a new assignment. He was to accompany a tax official conducting inspections near the river docks. The docks represented another side of Rome, rarely celebrated in grand stories. Thousands of workers unloaded cargo every day. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, luxury goods from distant provinces. The empire's economy flowed through these crowded waterfront districts. The work was exhausting. Men hauled enormous loads under the hot sun. Injuries were common. Pay was often low. Many laborers survived from one day to the next. Lucius watched a dockworker drop a heavy crate. The supervisor immediately began shouting. The worker apologized repeatedly. The supervisor struck him anyway. No one intervened. No one even appeared surprised. Violence occupied an ordinary place in Roman society. Parents beat children. Masters beat slaves. Supervisors beat workers. Teachers beat students. Punishment was expected. Harshness was often considered necessary. As the inspection continued, Lucius noticed a group of children scavenging near the waterfront. They searched through discarded refuse, broken containers, spoiled food, bits of rope, anything valuable. One boy found a piece of fruit that had fallen from a shipment. He immediately hid it beneath his tunic. The sight lingered in Lucius's mind. Rome controlled vast territories. Rome collected immense wealth. Yet children still searched garbage for food. Toward evening, the tax official completed his work. As they prepared to leave, a disturbance erupted nearby. Several guards were escorting a prisoner through the docks. A crowd gathered quickly. People whispered. The prisoner wore expensive clothing, despite being shackled. "Who is he?" someone asked. "A merchant." "What did he do?" "They say he refused to pay certain officials." Laughter spread through the crowd. Whether the accusation was true hardly mattered. Many people assumed corruption was involved. Trust in institutions only extended so far. On the journey back through the city, Lucius passed one of Rome's public execution sites. Workers were removing the remains of condemned criminals, displayed as warnings. The practice was intended to discourage crime. It also reminded everyone who held power. Fear served as a tool of governance. The empire relied on armies and laws, but it also relied upon spectacle. Citizens regularly witnessed punishment. The message remained clear: obey or suffer the consequences. That night, Lucius stopped at a tavern before returning home. The room buzzed with conversation. Wine flowed freely. Gamblers crowded around tables. A musician played in the corner. For a while, the atmosphere felt lighter than usual. People laughed, joked, shared stories. Yet even here, darker realities surfaced. A veteran described atrocities he had witnessed during military campaigns. A sailor spoke of pirates and shipwrecks. A farmer complained about taxes imposed after poor harvests. The empire's problems followed people wherever they went. Near midnight, Lucius left the tavern. The streets were quieter now. Torchlight flickered against stone walls. The air felt cooler. As he walked through a narrow alley, he heard voices ahead. 3 men surrounded a younger traveler. The situation looked wrong immediately. One man grabbed the traveler's cloak. Another demanded money. The victim resisted. A brief struggle followed. The thieves fled when nearby footsteps approached. The traveler collapsed against a wall. shaken but alive. Lucius helped him stand. "Are you injured?" "Only bruised." The traveler managed a weak smile. "Thank you." Crime was another reality of urban life. Rome employed guards. Authorities existed. Yet the sheer size of the city made complete security impossible. Pickpockets, thieves, fraudsters, and gangs operated throughout many districts. Most residents learned to remain cautious. Eventually, Lucius reached his apartment building. The stairway creaked beneath his feet. Neighbors slept behind thin walls. The familiar smell of bread drifted upward from the bakery below. He sat beside the small window and looked across the rooftops. Somewhere beyond the darkness stood palaces filled with luxury. Elsewhere, families worried about their next meal. The contrast seemed impossible to ignore. Rome presented itself as the greatest civilization on earth, and in many ways it truly was remarkable. Its roads connected continents. Its engineers built aqueducts and harbors. Its armies controlled vast territories. Its laws influenced future generations. But greatness carried a cost, and more often than not, ordinary people paid it. As Lucius prepared for sleep, distant shouting echoed through the night. Another argument, another arrest, another small tragedy unfolding somewhere in the enormous city. He could not know it yet, but events were already beginning to move beyond individual hardships, because in the coming days, Lucius would witness something even darker than poverty, corruption, or crime. He would discover how fear itself could become a weapon, and how quickly an empire could turn against its own people. The next morning arrived under a gray sky. A layer of cloud hung over Rome, muting the sunlight and making the city seem strangely subdued. Even the usual noise of Subura felt quieter than normal. Merchants still opened their stalls. Bakers still carried trays of bread into the streets. Donkeys still pulled overloaded carts through narrow lanes. Yet something felt different. People were whispering. Lucius noticed it almost immediately. Wherever small groups gathered, conversations stopped when strangers approached. Men lowered their voices. Women glanced over their shoulders before speaking. Even tavern owners seemed unusually cautious. At first, he assumed another political scandal had emerged. Rome never lacked scandals. But before noon, he learned the truth. An accusation had been made against a prominent nobleman. Not theft, not fraud, treason. In Rome, few words carried greater danger. A man accused of stealing money might lose property. A man accused of treason could lose everything: his wealth, his reputation, his family, his life. Lucius first heard details while copying records in the forum. Two lawyers discussed the case nearby. They found witnesses. Witnesses can be purchased. These ones claim they heard him criticize Nero. The second lawyer laughed softly. Then his fate is already decided. The exchange unsettled Lucius. because everyone understood the implication. Truth often mattered less than perception, especially when powerful figures felt threatened. The Roman Empire projected confidence, strength, order, stability, but beneath that image lurked constant anxiety. Emperors feared conspiracies. Senators feared rivals. Officials feared accusations. Citizens feared saying the wrong thing. Fear flowed downward through society like water. The higher a person climbed, the more dangerous politics became. Later that day, Lucius accompanied Senator Gaius to a gathering on the Palatine Hill. The atmosphere there felt completely different from Subura. Fountains splashed gently in shaded gardens. Servants moved silently across polished floors. Expensive perfumes filled the air. Yet even among the wealthy, tension was visible. Guests smiled, but their eyes remained watchful. Every conversation seemed carefully measured, every opinion carefully chosen. At one point, a senator praised Emperor Nero's recent performance as a musician. The compliment sounded excessive, almost theatrical. Several others immediately agreed. Lucius suspected many of them privately held different opinions, but public disagreement carried risks. One careless remark could travel surprisingly far. Informers existed everywhere. Some worked for political enemies. Others hoped to gain rewards. A casual conversation could become evidence. An accusation could become a death sentence. This was another side of Rome, rarely celebrated in heroic stories. Not just physical danger, psychological danger, the constant need to monitor one's words. As the afternoon progressed, Senator Gaius received visitors in a private room. Lucius remained nearby to record notes. Several discussions involved property disputes. Others involved taxes. Then the conversation shifted. A wealthy merchant leaned forward. "Have you heard what happened to Senator Cashin?" "No." "The authorities seized part of his estate." "Why?" "Association." The room fell silent. Association. A dangerous word. Sometimes merely knowing the wrong person could attract suspicion. The merchant lowered his voice further. "They say one of his friends was implicated in a conspiracy." Nobody responded immediately. The silence itself spoke volumes. Eventually, another guest changed the subject. No one wanted to linger on uncomfortable topics, especially topics that might be repeated later. When Lucius finally left the villa near sunset, he found himself thinking about power. Rome's rulers often presented themselves as guardians of stability, and in many ways they were. The empire provided roads, trade networks, laws, and security across enormous territories. Yet maintaining that system required constant control. Control over information. Control over public opinion. Control over potential rivals. The machinery of power could become ruthless when threatened. The thought stayed with him as he descended toward the lower districts. That evening, he stopped near a public square where a crowd had gathered around a speaker. The man stood atop a stone platform. His clothing suggested modest means. Perhaps a teacher, perhaps a philosopher. Public speakers were common in Rome. Some entertained, some educated, others criticized society. This speaker belonged to the third category. The city praises wealth, he declared. But who creates that wealth? Several listeners nodded. The laborer, more agreement. The farmer, a few murmurs. The soldier, the crowd grew larger. The slave, the final word, produced nervous glances. The speaker continued. Rome celebrates victories. Rome celebrates emperors. Rome celebrates noble families. Yet millions work unseen. The gathering remained attentive. For a moment, Lucius felt impressed. The man spoke honestly, courageously. Then he noticed guards approaching. The philosopher saw them too. His expression changed immediately. Within seconds, the speech ended. The crowd dispersed as though nothing had happened. No arrests occurred. No violence followed. Yet everyone understood. Certain ideas carried consequences. Freedom of speech existed only within limits, and those limits could shift without warning. Lucius continued walking. The encounter lingered in his thoughts, not because the speaker had been arrested, because he had been afraid, and so had everyone listening. Fear did not always require chains. Sometimes anticipation alone accomplished the same goal. The following day brought another assignment. A legal clerk required assistance documenting prison records. Lucius accepted reluctantly. He had never enjoyed visiting prisons. The experience was always unpleasant. The facility stood near one of Rome's administrative districts. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable. Stone walls, iron gates, few windows. Inside, conditions were far worse. The smell struck first. Sweat, waste, damp stone, desperation. Cells crowded narrow corridors. Prisoners sat on floors or leaned against walls. Some awaited trial. Others awaited punishment. A few awaited execution. Roman prisons generally served as holding facilities rather than long-term correctional institutions. Many inmates would eventually face sentences elsewhere. Still, the conditions remained harsh. Very harsh. Lucius spent several hours recording names and charges. Debt, theft, fraud, violence, political offenses. The list seemed endless. One prisoner caught his attention. An older man, educated, well-spoken. His charge involved insulting an official. Nothing more, at least according to the record. The man noticed Lucius reading. "Do you know what I actually did?" he asked quietly. Lucius hesitated. "No, I embarrassed someone powerful." Then he smiled, not happily, warily. The guard ordered silence before further conversation could occur. Yet the words remained in Lucius's mind. By evening, he was eager to leave. Fresh air felt like a gift. As he exited the prison grounds, he noticed workers transporting bodies toward a burial cart. 2 prisoners had died during the week. Neither appeared elderly. Disease spread easily in crowded conditions. Malnutrition worsened outcomes. Medical treatment remained limited. For many inmates, imprisonment itself could become a death sentence. The darker Lucius looked beneath Rome's surface, the more suffering he found. Not because Rome was uniquely evil. Every civilization contained hardship, but because Rome's glory often overshadowed its victims. History remembered emperors. History remembered generals. History remembered monuments. Ordinary people disappeared far more easily. That night rain began falling shortly after sunset. Water streamed through gutters. Torchlight reflected across wet stone streets. Many residents hurried indoors. Others had no choice but to remain outside. Lucius watched from beneath an awning. A homeless veteran sat wrapped in a worn cloak. Nearby, 2 children sheltered beneath a market stall. Across the street, wealthy guests entered a banquet hall illuminated by dozens of lamps. The contrast felt almost absurd. One city, completely different realities. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled overhead. Most people disappeared indoors. Eventually, Lucius headed home. As he climbed the stairs to his room, he noticed neighbors gathered in the corridor. Their expressions looked troubled. "What happened?" he asked. A woman answered. "Soldiers came earlier." "For whom?" "Nero." The reply made little sense. "For Nero. They were collecting names." "What names?" The woman lowered her voice. "People who might owe taxes." Several neighbors exchanged worried looks. That was rarely good news. Tax collectors already possessed a fearsome reputation. Additional investigations often signaled trouble. Lucius entered his room, feeling uneasy. Outside, rain continued striking the roof. Wind rattled loose shutters. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally arrived, strange dreams followed. Dreams of endless crowds, endless voices, endless fear. The next morning, Rome awoke to shocking news. A respected knight had been arrested during the night. No official explanation had been provided. Rumors spread instantly. Some claimed conspiracy. Others claimed corruption. Others whispered that the man had angered someone close to the emperor. No one knew the truth, yet everyone discussed it. Quietly, very quietly, because in ancient Rome, uncertainty could be almost as frightening as certainty. And Lucius was beginning to realize that the empire's darkest weapon was not always violence. Sometimes it was simply convincing people that violence might come next. The arrest of the knight became the only topic anyone wanted to discuss, and yet almost nobody discussed it openly. That contradiction fascinated Lucius. Throughout the following day, fragments of conversation drifted through Rome like smoke. In bakeries, customers lowered their voices. In bathhouses, men glanced around before speaking. At taverns, rumors traveled from table to table, becoming more dramatic with each retelling. The knight had insulted Nero. No, he had stolen money. No, he had joined a conspiracy. No, he had planned an assassination. No one knew. Everyone speculated. The truth had become buried beneath fear. As Lucius walked through the forum that morning, he noticed how quickly uncertainty could reshape behavior. People became cautious. Words became measured. Even jokes became rarer. One merchant, who normally complained loudly about taxes, now smiled whenever officials passed. Another praised government policies he had criticized only weeks earlier. Fear rarely transformed opinions. It transformed what people were willing to say. That distinction mattered. Near the Basilica Julia, Lucius encountered an old acquaintance named Publius. The man worked as a clerk for a magistrate. They exchanged greetings before finding a quieter corner beneath a portico. Publius leaned closer. "You've heard about the arrest." "Everyone has." The clerk nodded. Then he surprised Lucius. "I know someone involved." Lucius immediately felt nervous. "Should you be telling me that?" "Probably not." The answer made both men glance around. No one seemed to be listening. Still, Publius lowered his voice further. "The evidence may not be very strong." "What evidence?" "A witness." "Only one." Publius shrugged. "Sometimes one is enough." Lucius frowned. "That doesn't seem right." The clerk laughed bitterly. "Right and useful are different things." The remark lingered after they parted ways, because it reflected a reality many Romans understood. Law and justice were not always identical. The legal system could accomplish remarkable things. It could also become a tool, a weapon, an instrument serving power rather than fairness. As the morning continued, Lucius completed several assignments before receiving new instructions from Senator Gaius. A provincial governor had arrived in Rome. Several records required copying. The work would occupy most of the afternoon. The governor's residence overflowed with activity. Messengers came and went constantly. Officials carried scrolls through crowded corridors. Servants hurried between rooms. The empire stretched across enormous distances, and administration generated endless paperwork. While organizing documents, Lucius encountered reports from distant provinces. Some described trade, others described military activity. A few described tax collection. One report caught his attention. A governor complained that local farmers could no longer meet revenue demands after repeated poor harvests. The response attached to the document was brief: collect the taxes anyway. Lucius stared at the words. No discussion, no adjustment, no sympathy. The order seemed cold, yet perhaps that was the point. Empires depended upon revenue. Armies required payment. Roads required maintenance. Officials required salaries. The machine had to keep moving, even when ordinary people suffered. Throughout history, countless governments faced the same temptation. Protect the system first. Address human consequences later. Sometimes much later. When evening arrived, Lucius finally left the governor's residence. Instead of heading directly home, he wandered toward the river. The docks remained active despite the fading light. Workers unloaded cargo beneath torches. Sailors shouted instructions. Crates moved continuously from ships to warehouses. Rome never truly slept. Too many people depended upon its economy. Too much wealth flowed through its streets. As Lucius watched the activity, he noticed an elderly laborer struggling beneath a heavy load. The man stumbled. The crate slipped. Several jars shattered against the stone. Instantly, a supervisor rushed forward. The laborer attempted to apologize. The supervisor responded by striking him. Again and again, the old man did not resist. Years of experience had likely taught him that resistance would only worsen the situation. Eventually, the beating stopped. The laborer returned to work. Blood trickled from his lip. Nobody seemed surprised. Nobody intervened. The scene disturbed Lucius more than it once might have. Not because violence was unusual, because it was routine. Human beings often adapt to what surrounds them. Romans adapted to spectacles of punishment, to slavery, to inequality, to suffering many no longer noticed, or perhaps noticing simply felt pointless. As darkness deepened, Lucius continued through the city. His route took him past a large mansion belonging to one of Rome's wealthiest families. Musicians played inside. Laughter drifted through open windows. Dozens of lamps illuminated gardens filled with statues and fountains. Outside the gates, however, several beggars sat in the shadows. One woman held a sleeping child. Another man displayed a crippled leg in hopes of attracting sympathy. The contrast was impossible to miss. Inside luxury, outside desperation, both existing side by side. Rome concentrated wealth on a scale few cities had ever witnessed. Some aristocrats possessed fortunes beyond imagination. They owned estates across multiple provinces, hundreds of slaves, ships, businesses, entire villages. Meanwhile, countless citizens worried daily about food and rent. The gap between classes could feel enormous. The following morning brought a different assignment. Senator Gaius required records delivered to a villa outside the city. The journey offered Lucius a rare opportunity to leave Rome's crowded streets. As he traveled along a paved road lined with tombs and monuments, he noticed how quickly the landscape changed. The city's noise gradually faded. Fields stretched across the countryside. Farm workers labored beneath the sun, olive groves covered nearby hills. At first, the scenery appeared peaceful. Then Lucius noticed something. Many of the workers were slaves. Large agricultural estates known as latifundia had become increasingly common. Wealthy owners purchased vast tracts of land and staffed them with enslaved labor. Small independent farmers often struggled to compete. Some lost their land entirely. Many migrated to cities, like Rome, seeking work. The process enriched elites while destabilizing traditional communities. A steward traveling with Lucius pointed toward one estate. Profitable property. How many workers? Hundreds. The answer felt unsettling. Hundreds of lives controlled by a single owner. Hundreds of people whose futures depended upon another person's decisions. When they reached the villa, Lucius completed his task quickly. Before departing, he wandered briefly through part of the estate. The fields stretched farther than he expected. Workers bent beneath the heat. Supervisors watched closely. The atmosphere felt disciplined, efficient, and strangely silent. Very little conversation occurred. The silence itself carried meaning. Returning to Rome late that afternoon, Lucius reflected upon what he had seen. The empire's prosperity rested upon labor, massive amounts of labor, yet those performing it often received the smallest rewards. Some received no rewards at all. By the time he reached Subura, the streets were crowded again. A group of children chased one another between market stalls. Vendors argued over prices. A musician played a flute near a fountain. Life appeared normal. Then shouting erupted nearby. A crowd formed almost instantly. Lucius pushed closer. 2 tax collectors stood beside a small shop. The owner argued desperately. "I already paid. You still owe. I have the receipt." One collector examined the document, then shrugged. "It is insufficient." The shopkeeper's face turned pale. Several neighbors watched nervously. Everyone understood what might happen next. Property could be seized, goods confiscated, livelihood destroyed. The argument continued for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, money changed hands. The collectors departed. The crowd dispersed. The shopkeeper remained behind, staring at the nearly empty coin pouch in his hands. No celebration followed. He had avoided immediate disaster. Nothing more. That evening, Lucius visited a public bathhouse. He hoped to clear his mind. Instead, he encountered another reminder of Rome's darker realities. Several veterans discussed military campaigns along the empire's frontiers. Most stories involved hardship, marches through freezing terrain, disease outbreaks, starvation, executions. One veteran described a rebellion in a distant province. The response had been brutal. Villages burned, prisoners crucified, entire communities punished. The listeners nodded as though hearing something inevitable. Perhaps they were. Rome maintained control through strength, and strength often meant violence. Conquest created the empire. Violence preserved it. Later, as Lucius prepared to leave, one of the veterans stopped him. "You write for senators, don't you?" "Sometimes." The old soldier smiled sadly. "Then write this someday." Lucius waited. The veteran looked into the steam rising from the baths. "People remember victories." His expression hardened. "They forget the cost." For several moments, neither man spoke. Then the veteran walked away. Lucius remained where he stood, because those few words seemed to summarize everything he had been witnessing. Rome's monuments survived. Its triumphs survived. Its legends survived. But countless ordinary lives vanished from memory. Their suffering rarely appeared in official histories. Their sacrifices rarely received statues. Their names disappeared. And increasingly, Lucius felt compelled to look where others preferred not to, toward the shadows behind the glory, toward the people history often ignored. Yet he still had no idea how dark those shadows truly were, because events were already unfolding elsewhere in the city, events that would soon expose one of the most terrifying realities of ancient Rome, a reality that could destroy innocent lives overnight. Not through war, not through crime, but through suspicion alone. The rumors began quietly. At first, they seemed no different from the countless stories that circulated through Rome every day. A merchant had disappeared. A senator was under investigation. A provincial governor had offended someone important. Most rumors faded within a few days. These did not. By the end of the week, whispers had spread through nearly every district of the city. Someone was compiling names. No one knew exactly who. No one knew exactly why. Yet people kept hearing the same thing. Questions were being asked. Records were being examined. Associations were being investigated. The uncertainty itself became frightening. Lucius first noticed the change while working in the forum. Normally, the square buzzed with argument. Lawyers debated loudly. Merchants negotiated openly. Citizens complained about taxes, grain prices, and politics. Now conversations often stopped when unfamiliar faces approached. People became careful, watchful, suspicious. It was as though an invisible storm hung over the city. One afternoon, Lucius encountered Publius again. The clerk looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. "You look terrible," Lucius said. Publius forced a smile. "I haven't been sleeping." "Why?" The clerk hesitated, then answered quietly. "Because my superior was questioned yesterday." Lucius felt his stomach tighten. About what? He doesn't know. The answer sounded absurd, yet it reflected a reality that Romans occasionally faced. Investigations did not always begin with clear accusations. Sometimes officials gathered information first. Sometimes they simply created pressure. Fear often encouraged cooperation. People became eager to demonstrate loyalty, eager to distance themselves from anyone who appeared suspicious. Publius rubbed his forehead. The worst part is not knowing. Lucius understood. Human beings can endure many hardships. Uncertainty often proves among the most difficult. After they parted, Lucius spent the remainder of the day unable to focus. The city seemed different now, not because buildings had changed, because people had changed. Every glance felt more cautious. Every conversation felt more measured. Fear was spreading, and fear had a remarkable ability to transform entire communities. That evening, Lucius received an invitation to accompany Senator Gaius to a dinner hosted by another aristocratic family. The gathering promised excellent food, expensive wine, and influential guests. Under ordinary circumstances, such events fascinated him. This time he felt reluctant. Nevertheless, duty required attendance. The banquet began shortly after sunset. Guests reclined on luxurious couches beneath painted ceilings. Servants carried silver trays piled with delicacies. Musicians performed softly in the background. Everything appeared elegant. Everything appeared civilized. Yet beneath the surface, tension remained. Lucius noticed it immediately. People laughed, but not as freely as before. Political discussions started and stopped abruptly. Several guests seemed reluctant to express opinions. At one point, a senator made a mild joke concerning government officials. The room fell silent, only for a moment, but the silence was noticeable. The speaker quickly changed subjects. Others followed his lead. The conversation moved elsewhere. No explanation was necessary. Everyone understood. As the evening progressed, Lucius found himself recording notes near a group of older aristocrats. Their discussion eventually turned toward earlier periods of Roman history. One man mentioned the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Another referenced Emperor Caligula. A third shook his head. People forget how dangerous those years could be. Several guests nodded. One accusation could destroy a family, sometimes an entire household. Even friends became liabilities. The remarks carried unusual weight because they were not discussing distant enemies. They were discussing fellow Romans. One of the darker truths about imperial Rome was that political fear periodically turned inward. The empire possessed enormous external power, yet some of its most destructive moments involved citizens turning against one another, neighbors reporting neighbors, associates abandoning associates, families distancing themselves from relatives. The mechanisms varied. The results often looked similar. As the banquet ended, Lucius accompanied Senator Gaius toward the exit. Before leaving, he overheard two servants speaking quietly. Their conversation caught his attention, not because of what they said, because of how they said it. One servant repeatedly looked over his shoulder. The other barely whispered. Even household workers felt uneasy. Fear respected no social class. The following morning, a disturbing event occurred in Subura. A shopkeeper named Decimus failed to open his store. At first, nobody thought much of it. People overslept occasionally. Illness happened. Delays happened. Then neighbors noticed soldiers standing outside his building. By midday, everyone knew something had happened. Decimus had been arrested. No official explanation appeared. No charges were announced. Nothing. The uncertainty proved almost worse than bad news. People began speculating immediately. Tax fraud, political connections, debt, conspiracy. No one knew. Lucius spoke briefly with a neighbor who had known the shopkeeper for years. Did he do something? The man shrugged helplessly. I don't think so. The answer offered little comfort. Many citizens believed innocence should guarantee safety. History repeatedly demonstrated otherwise. Sometimes innocence mattered. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes powerful people made mistakes. And when institutions made mistakes, ordinary individuals paid the price. Over the next several days, more stories emerged. Another merchant questioned. A former official investigated. Several properties searched. Most Romans would never personally experience such scrutiny. Yet the atmosphere affected everyone. Fear does not require universal application, only visibility. If enough people witness consequences, behavior changes. Lucius began noticing other effects. Taverns grew quieter. Political discussions became rarer. Public criticism diminished. People monitored themselves. Self-censorship accomplished what direct punishment often could not. One afternoon, while crossing the Forum, Lucius observed a striking example. A street philosopher stood atop a small platform, addressing passers-by. Such figures were common. Some attracted large audiences. Others attracted ridicule. This philosopher began discussing virtue, then justice, then responsibility. The crowd listened politely. At one point, he seemed ready to criticize certain officials. The words almost emerged. Then he stopped himself. Everyone noticed. The audience exchanged glances. The philosopher changed direction immediately. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it revealed something important. Fear had become internal. No guard interrupted him. No official threatened him. He censored himself because the possibility of consequences was enough. That evening, Lucius visited the river district to deliver documents. The docks remained crowded as always. Ships arrived continuously. Workers unloaded cargo beneath the fatting sunlight. Business continued. Empires rarely stop functioning because people are afraid. If anything, they often become more efficient. Yet even here tension appeared. Several laborers discussed recent arrests. One man lowered his voice. My cousin knew Decimus. Another shook his head. Don't talk about it. The warning came instantly. Not angry, not hostile, simply practical. Many Romans learned an important survival skill, knowing when not to speak. As darkness approached, Lucius finished his task and began walking home. The streets glowed with torchlight. Shadows stretched across stone walls. From a distance, Rome looked magnificent. Temples illuminated against the night sky. Monuments rising above rooftops. The capital of an empire. The center of the known world. Yet beauty often concealed harsher realities. Near the Forum, he encountered an elderly veteran sitting beside a fountain. The man appeared familiar. After a moment, Lucius recognized him. The same veteran from the bathhouse. The one who had spoken about the cost of victories. The old soldier gestured toward the city. Still observing, Lucius smiled slightly. Trying to. The veteran studied him. And what have you learned? Lucius considered the question carefully. Finally, he answered, that people are afraid. The veteran nodded. They always are. Always. Perhaps not always. The old man looked toward the distant Palatine Hill. But often enough, several moments passed. Then the veteran continued. Most people imagine power as soldiers, prisons, and executions. Lucius listened closely. They forget something. What? The veteran's expression hardened. The most effective power is the kind people enforce upon themselves. The words lingered long after the conversation ended, because Lucius sensed their truth. Fear did not always need chains. Fear could live inside the mind, inside habits, inside daily choices, inside silence. By the time he reached his apartment, the city had grown quiet. Rain clouds drifted across the moon. A cool wind moved through the alley below. Neighbors closed shutters. Torches flickered. Rome settled into uneasy sleep. But before dawn, another piece of news would spread through the city. News far more shocking than the arrests, far more frightening than the rumors, because a respected senator had suddenly vanished. And when people began asking questions, they discovered something terrifying. No one seemed willing to answer. The senator disappeared sometime during the night. At least, that was the story people told the next morning. By sunrise, rumors had already spread across markets, bathhouses, workshops, and taverns. By noon, nearly every district of Rome was discussing the same mystery. A senator had vanished. Not a minor official, not a merchant, not a criminal, a member of Rome's governing elite. And nobody seemed willing to explain what had happened. Lucius first heard the news while buying bread in Subura. The baker's shop was crowded as usual. Customers argued over prices. Children waited impatiently. Flour dust floated through the air. Yet all conversation eventually returned to the same subject. The soldiers came after midnight. No, before midnight. I heard he fled. I heard he was arrested. My cousin works near the Palatine. He says nobody is talking. That last detail troubled Lucius most. Nobody is talking. In Rome, silence often carried meaning. People talked endlessly about victories. They talked endlessly about scandals. They talked endlessly about gossip. When nobody talked, it usually meant fear had entered the conversation. After finishing his purchase, Lucius headed toward the forum. The atmosphere there felt noticeably different. Normally, crowds filled every corner. Lawyers argued. Merchants negotiated. Politicians delivered speeches. Today, many discussions seemed unusually restrained. Groups gathered briefly before dispersing. Whispers replaced debates. The uncertainty surrounding the disappearance had infected the city. Humans dislike unanswered questions. The less information available, the more imagination fills the gap. As Lucius crossed the square, he encountered Publius once again. The clerk looked worse than ever. "You've heard?" Publius asked immediately. "The senator." Publius nodded. "What happened?" The clerk laughed bitterly. "If I knew, I'd probably be afraid to tell you." The answer did not feel like a joke. Lucius lowered his voice. "Do you think he was arrested?" "I think nobody wants to be connected to him." That observation revealed something important. Fear does not merely affect the target. It spreads outward. Friends become cautious. Associates become distant. Relationships become liabilities. Even suspicion can damage reputations. Publius glanced around before speaking again. Yesterday, people wanted answers. And now they want distance. After they parted ways, Lucius spent much of the morning organizing legal records. Yet concentration proved difficult. The city felt increasingly tense. The disappearance of a senator suggested something unsettling. If powerful individuals could suddenly vanish, what protection existed for everyone else? The question lingered throughout the day. Later that afternoon, Senator Gaius summoned Lucius to his villa. The request arrived unexpectedly. When Lucius reached the Palatine Hill, he immediately noticed increased security. Additional guards stood near entrances. Visitors were screened more carefully. Servants moved with unusual urgency. Inside the villa, conversations seemed carefully controlled. The senator himself appeared calm, perhaps too calm, as Lucius copied correspondence in a nearby room. Several guests discussed recent events. No one mentioned the missing senator directly. Instead, they spoke in circles. The current situation is unfortunate. Stability must be maintained. Certain individuals create unnecessary complications. The language fascinated Lucius. Everyone understood the topic. Nobody named it. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. During a break, Lucius wandered briefly through the garden. The grounds overlooked large sections of Rome. From this elevated position, the city appeared magnificent. Temples gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. Aqueducts stretched across the landscape. Monuments testified to centuries of conquest and engineering. Visitors often saw this version of Rome, the glorious version, the version immortalized in statues and triumphal arches. But Lucius had begun noticing another version, the hidden version, the one existing beneath the polished surface. A city where fear shaped conversations. A city where poverty consumed lives. A city where power often mattered more than justice. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. That evening, as he descended from the Palatine, Lucius encountered a procession moving through the streets. At first, he assumed it was religious. Then he recognized the symbols. Funeral banners. Another burial. Funerals occurred constantly in Rome. Disease, accidents, violence, and poor living conditions ensured a steady flow of death. The city was alive with people. It was also surrounded by graves. As the procession passed, Lucius noticed how ordinary the scene seemed. Most participants were not wealthy. No grand tomb awaited them. No historian would record their names. Yet their lives had mattered. To spouses, to children, to friends. History often remembers emperors. Ordinary people remember each other. Sometimes that distinction matters more. The following day brought another reminder of Rome's harsher realities. A warehouse collapse occurred near the river district. The structure had been old, poorly maintained, overloaded. The combination proved disastrous. Several workers died. Others remained trapped beneath debris. By the time Lucius arrived, rescue efforts were underway. Crowds gathered around the ruins. Families searched desperately for loved ones. Laborers removed broken timbers piece by piece. The scene felt chaotic, painful, real. One woman repeatedly asked whether her husband had survived. No one could answer. An elderly father searched for his son. Children cried. The tragedy dominated conversation throughout the area. Yet what happened afterward disturbed Lucius almost as much as the collapse itself. By the next morning, business resumed. Merchants reopened stalls. Ships unloaded cargo. Supervisors hired replacement workers. Life moved forward, not because people were cruel, because Rome rarely paused. The city consumed labor continuously. When one worker died, another usually took his place. Human lives often felt interchangeable, particularly among the poor. That realization haunted Lucius. The empire celebrated individual greatness, yet ordinary individuals often seemed disposable. Several days later, another development intensified public anxiety. Properties connected to the missing senator were seized. Officially, no explanation accompanied the action. Unofficially, speculation exploded. Now people assumed the disappearance had not been voluntary. The implications frightened many. A merchant at the bathhouse summarized the mood perfectly. Yesterday, nobody knew anything. Several listeners nodded. Today, nobody wants to know anything. Laughter followed. Nervous laughter. The the kind people use when discussing uncomfortable truths. That evening, Lucius visited a public bathhouse, hoping to escape the city's tension. Instead, he encountered more evidence of it. Groups that normally discussed politics now focused on sports. Men who once criticized officials now praised public projects. Subjects changed quickly whenever strangers approached. The atmosphere felt restrained, not openly oppressive, simply cautious. Perhaps that made it more effective. As Lucius sat near the warm pools, he overheard two veterans discussing military discipline. One remark caught his attention. Fear keeps soldiers obedient. The other veteran shook his head. Only for a while. What works longer? The older man considered carefully. Convincing them obedience is their own choice. The statement reminded Lucius of the veteran's earlier observation. The strongest power is often self-enforced. Empires understood this lesson long before modern governments existed. People who monitor themselves require fewer guards. People who censor themselves require fewer punishments. Fear can become efficient, very efficient. When Lucius finally left the bathhouse, darkness had fallen. The streets glowed beneath scattered torchlight. A cool breeze moved through the city. For a brief moment, Rome felt peaceful, almost serene. Then shouting erupted nearby. Several guards rushed past. A crowd quickly formed. Curiosity pulled Lucius closer. The disturbance centered around a small apartment building. Residents stood outside, confused, anxious. One family had been removed during the night. Neighbors claimed officials had searched their rooms. Documents had been confiscated. No explanation provided. Again, the pattern felt increasingly familiar. Questions, investigations, disappearances, silence. No one understood the full picture, yet everyone felt its effects. As Lucius returned home, he found himself studying the faces around him. Shopkeepers, laborers, servants, craftsmen. Most were simply trying to survive. Pay rent, buy food, protect family. Yet larger forces constantly shaped their lives. Political decisions, economic pressures, social hierarchies, fear. The dark side of Rome was not only found in gladiatorial arenas or slave markets. Those horrors were visible. This darkness was different, more subtle, more pervasive. It lived inside uncertainty, inside unequal systems, inside the knowledge that ordinary people possessed little control over events unfolding above them. That night, Lucius struggled to sleep. Wind rattled the shutters. Rain tapped softly against the roof. Somewhere beyond the darkness stood palaces, prisons, temples, and government offices. The machinery of empire continued turning, relentlessly, and before long, a disaster would strike Rome itself, a catastrophe so enormous that generations would remember it, a catastrophe that would expose both the strengths and the weaknesses of the greatest city in the ancient world. A catastrophe made of fire. The summer of 64 CE arrived hot, dry, and uneasy. For weeks, Rome baked beneath relentless sunlight. Dust coated the streets. Wooden buildings creaked in the heat. Market vendors complained about the weather. Sailors complained about the lack of wind, and laborers complained about everything. Yet beneath the ordinary frustrations of daily life, a deeper tension lingered. The rumors, the investigations, the disappearances, the uncertainty, none of those concerns would matter much longer, because something far worse was coming, something that would change Rome forever. On the evening before the disaster, Lucius worked late at Senator Gaius's villa. The senator had received correspondence from several provinces and required copies prepared immediately. The task kept Lucius occupied until well after sunset. By the time he left the Palatine Hill, the city glowed beneath thousands of oil lamps. Rome at night possessed a strange beauty. Torchlight flickered along streets. Music drifted from taverns. Voices echoed between apartment buildings. The city seemed alive, almost immortal. No one walking those streets could have imagined how quickly everything was about to change. Lucius returned to his room shortly before midnight. Exhaustion carried him into sleep almost immediately. Then the shouting began. At first it appeared in his dreams. Distant voices, confused noises, running footsteps. Gradually, the sounds became louder, closer, real. Lucius opened his eyes. Someone was screaming outside. Not arguing, screaming. He sat upright. The smell reached him before anything else. Smoke, a large amount of smoke. Instantly, he rushed to the window. His heart sank. A reddish glow illuminated part of the night sky. Fire, a very large fire. People flooded into the streets below. Some pointed toward the southern districts. Others ran in the opposite direction. The shouting intensified. Within minutes, church bells, alarm calls, and panicked voices blended into one enormous roar. Lucius grabbed his cloak and hurried downstairs. Outside, confusion dominated everything. Nobody seemed certain where the fire had started. Some claimed it began near the Circus Maximus. Others insisted it started in nearby warehouses. Rumors spread faster than facts. What mattered was simple. The fire was growing. Fast, very fast. Strong winds pushed flames through tightly packed neighborhoods filled with wooden structures. Rome's crowded design became a deadly weakness. Narrow streets trapped heat. Closely packed buildings allowed flames to jump easily from roof to roof. Entire blocks ignited with terrifying speed. As Lucius moved toward higher ground, he witnessed scenes he would remember for the rest of his life. Families carrying whatever possessions they could save. Children crying. Merchants dragging carts loaded with valuables. elderly residents struggling through smoke-filled streets, animals running loose in panic. Everywhere people shouted conflicting instructions. Go north. No, the fire is spreading there. Run toward the river. The river is crowded. Chaos ruled. Hours passed. The fire continued advancing. By dawn, enormous sections of Rome were burning. From elevated positions, the destruction looked almost unreal. Columns of smoke rose into the sky. Entire districts vanished beneath flames. Buildings collapsed. Roofs caved inward. Sparks traveled through the air like swarms of insects. The city seemed to be consuming itself. Lucius spent much of the morning helping residents carry belongings away from threatened areas. Again and again, he witnessed heartbreaking choices. People abandoning homes, families leaving behind possessions accumulated across generations, parents choosing which items to save because they could not carry everything. Some saved money, others saved family shrines, others saved nothing except each other. In moments of crisis, priorities become clear. By afternoon, the situation had worsened dramatically. The fire had become too large to control. The vigils fought desperately. Citizens formed bucket lines. Buildings were demolished to create fire breaks. Still, the flames advanced. The heat felt overwhelming, even from a distance. At one point, Lucius encountered a woman kneeling beside the ruins of her home. She stared silently at the destruction. Everything she owned was gone. Years of work erased in a single night. Around her, thousands faced similar losses. The Great Fire exposed a brutal truth about ancient Rome. For all its engineering achievements and military power, the city remained vulnerable, very vulnerable. Many residents lived in structures that were poorly built, overcrowded, and dangerously flammable. Landlords often prioritized profit over safety. Cheap construction produced larger returns. The consequences became devastating when disaster struck. As evening approached, exhaustion spread through the population. Many refugees gathered in open spaces, parks, gardens, temples, any location offering temporary safety. Food quickly became a concern. Water became a concern. Shelter became a concern. The city still existed, but countless lives had been thrown into uncertainty. That night, Lucius slept outdoors among hundreds of displaced residents. The air smelled of smoke. Children cried intermittently. People whispered about loved ones who remained missing. Others discussed rumors surrounding the disaster. Some believed the fire was accidental. Others suspected sabotage. Others blamed enemies of Rome. Nobody knew. And during disasters, uncertainty often creates conspiracy theories. The next morning revealed even greater devastation. Entire districts had disappeared. Familiar streets no longer existed. Landmarks had vanished. Neighborhoods had become blackened ruins. The scale shocked everyone. Lucius walked through portions of the damaged city, searching for acquaintances. Several survived. Others had disappeared. Whether they had escaped, died, or become separated from family remained unclear. The uncertainty proved agonizing. Throughout history, disasters frequently create two tragedies: the destruction itself and the waiting for news, waiting for answers, waiting to discover who survived. Days passed. The fire continued burning in some areas before finally subsiding. When the smoke eventually cleared, Rome confronted an enormous challenge. Rebuilding. The task would require years, perhaps decades. Yet amid the destruction, another darker process began. The search for blame. Humans rarely accept catastrophe without seeking explanations. Who caused it? Who failed to stop it? Who should be punished? Those questions echoed throughout the city. Rumors intensified. Some accused officials. Others accused merchants. Others accused foreigners. Still others accused religious minorities. Fear and uncertainty created fertile ground for scapegoats. The pattern would repeat throughout history countless times. When societies suffer, vulnerable groups often become targets. Lucius noticed the shift almost immediately. People who had previously spoken only about survival now discussed responsibility. Anger replaced shock. Accusations replaced confusion. The emotional transformation happened remarkably quickly. One evening, while helping distribute food among displaced residents, Lucius overheard a heated argument. A man insisted he had seen individuals deliberately spreading flames. Another claimed those individuals worked for political enemies. A third accused an entirely different group. None possessed evidence, yet certainty remained strong. Facts often struggle to compete with fear. As rebuilding efforts slowly began, Emperor Nero himself became a major subject of discussion. Some praised his response. Others criticized it. Some claimed he provided relief. Others claimed he cared only about appearances. Opinions varied depending on whom one asked. What remained undeniable was that the fire had transformed Rome. Physically, politically, emotionally, the city would never look exactly the same again. For ordinary people, however, immediate concerns mattered most. Finding shelter, finding work, finding food. Thousands had lost everything. Thousands more feared what might come next. Because disasters often create opportunities. Opportunities for reform. Opportunities for profit. And sometimes opportunities for persecution. Lucius began hearing troubling reports. Officials were investigating potential culprits. Names were being collected. Suspicions examined. Stories evaluated. At first, this seemed reasonable. A catastrophe of this magnitude demanded investigation. Yet history taught an uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes investigations seek truth. Sometimes they seek someone to blame. The difference can change countless lives. One evening, as the sun set behind the ruins of a burned district, Lucius stood beside the veteran he had come to know over recent months. Together, they watched workers clearing debris. The old soldier remained silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. People think fire is the worst part. Lucius looked toward the destroyed neighborhoods. What could be worse than this? The veteran's expression darkened. The things people do afterward. For a moment, neither man spoke, because both understood. The flames had destroyed buildings. What came next might destroy lives. And across Rome, powerful men were already deciding who would carry the blame for the greatest disaster the city had ever known. The fire was finally gone, but the smoke lingered, not just in the air, in people's minds. Weeks after the flames died, blackened ruins still stretched across enormous sections of Rome. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Streets that Lucius had walked his entire life no longer existed. Familiar landmarks had become piles of broken stone and ash. Every day, thousands wandered through the wreckage, searching for anything salvageable. A tool, a coin, a family heirloom, a piece of a former life. Most found very little. The city had survived. Many individual lives had not. Yet even as survivors struggled to rebuild, another battle was beginning. The battle over blame. Lucius noticed it everywhere. In taverns, at bathhouses, in markets, at food distribution centers. People argued constantly. Who started the fire? Was it an accident? Was it arson? Was it negligence? Had someone benefited from the destruction? Every theory found believers. Every rumor gained supporters. Facts remained scarce. Emotions remained abundant. One morning, while helping a merchant recover goods from a damaged warehouse, Lucius overheard two laborers arguing. "I heard Nero ordered it." The second man immediately looked around. "Keep your voice down. It's what people are saying. People say many things." The first laborer lowered his voice, but continued. "They say he wanted to rebuild the city. And you believe that?" "I don't know what I believe." That answer captured the mood perfectly. Most Romans did not know what to believe, but uncertainty creates opportunity, especially for those who control information. As reconstruction efforts expanded, workers flooded into damaged districts. Demolition crews cleared unstable structures. Engineers surveyed ruined streets. Architects discussed new designs. For the first time, portions of Rome would be rebuilt according to more organized plans. Wider roads, improved spacing, stricter construction requirements. In some ways, the disaster created progress. Yet progress came with a cost. Many poor residents discovered they could not easily return. Their old homes no longer existed. New construction required money. Land values shifted. Powerful individuals purchased damaged property at favorable prices. The wealthy often recover from disasters faster than everyone else. The pattern is ancient, very ancient. One afternoon, Lucius accompanied Senator Gaius through a partially cleared district. The senator discussed rebuilding projects with several officials. As they walked, Lucius observed hundreds of displaced residents living in temporary shelters. Children played among ruins. Families cooked simple meals over small fires. People waited and waited and waited for news, for housing, for assistance. Some would eventually recover. Others never would. The dark side of Rome was not merely the catastrophe itself. It was how unevenly people experienced the consequences. A wealthy family might lose a villa and still possess estates elsewhere. A laborer might lose a single room and lose everything. That distinction mattered more than most official histories acknowledged. Several days later, disturbing reports began circulating. Authorities had identified suspects. At least that was the claim. Specific groups were now attracting attention. Specific communities, specific individuals. The details varied depending upon who told the story, but a clear pattern emerged. The search for answers was becoming a search for scapegoats. Lucius first recognized the danger while visiting a food distribution center. Two men discussed recent developments nearby. They found the guilty ones already, so they say. How convenient. The second remark earned a nervous glance. People had become very careful. Even skepticism could feel dangerous. As the days passed, accusations intensified. Public opinion shifted. Fear evolved into anger, and anger always seeks a target. History would remember this period for many reasons. One of the most important was the treatment of a growing religious minority, a small group many Romans already viewed with suspicion, a group whose beliefs seemed strange to outsiders, a group that lacked political influence, a group that could not easily defend itself. The Christians. At this point in history, Christianity remained relatively small. Most Romans knew little about it. Rumors filled the gaps. Some believed Christians practiced bizarre rituals. Others considered them disloyal. Others simply viewed them as strange. Misunderstanding created suspicion. Suspicion created vulnerability. The conditions were perfect. Lucius first encountered this reality through a neighbor named Titus. The man worked near one of the city's marketplaces. One evening, Titus arrived visibly disturbed. What happened? Lucius asked. The neighbor hesitated, then answered quietly. They arrested several people. For what? They were Christians. Lucius frowned. Did they start the fire? Titus shrugged. I don't know. The answer carried enormous significance. Many people did not know. Yet arrests continued. Investigations expanded. Public accusations multiplied. The machinery had begun moving. And once powerful institutions begin moving in a particular direction, stopping them can prove difficult. Over the following weeks, stories spread rapidly, some likely true, others almost certainly exaggerated. The challenge was distinguishing between them. One tale described Christians confessing, another described torture, another described witnesses, another described fabricated evidence. No ordinary citizen possessed access to complete information. Most relied upon rumors. Rumors are dangerous foundations for justice. Lucius increasingly sensed that something troubling was happening, not because he belonged to the targeted group, because he recognized a familiar pattern: fear, uncertainty, accusation, punishment, the sequence repeated throughout history, again and again, and often the people caught in its path lacked the power to resist. One evening, he discussed the situation with the veteran. The old soldier listened carefully before responding. "Have you ever noticed something?" "What?" People prefer simple explanations. Lucius nodded slowly. The veteran continued. "A fire destroys half the city." "Yes, that's frightening." "It is. So people search for a cause they can understand." The old man stared toward the ruins in the distance. "They want a face." The observation felt painfully accurate. Disasters are chaotic, random, complex. Human beings often prefer certainty, even false certainty, because uncertainty feels unbearable. As autumn approached, reconstruction continued. New buildings rose. Roads were widened. Plans were drafted. Rome slowly began reshaping itself. Yet beneath the visible rebuilding, deeper wounds remained. Distrust, fear, resentment. The city had changed, not only physically, emotionally. People viewed one another differently now. Neighbors became suspicious. Communities became cautious. Public confidence weakened. The fire had exposed vulnerabilities that many preferred to ignore. The following month, Lucius received an unusual assignment. Several records needed delivering to administrative offices near one of the city's detention facilities. The task seemed routine until he arrived. Outside the facility stood family members waiting for news. Mothers, fathers, spouses, children. Their expressions revealed exhaustion. Some had traveled long distances. Others had waited for days. Many simply wanted information. Any information. One woman approached a guard. "Please." The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. "Just tell me if he's alive." The guard refused. The woman stepped away silently. Lucius watched the scene unfold, and suddenly the broader political discussions felt very different. Governments discuss investigations. Families experience consequences. History discuss policies. Individuals experience suffering. The difference is easy to forget, especially when studying the past. as he left the facility later that afternoon. He passed a line of prisoners being escorted between buildings. Most kept their eyes down. Some looked terrified. Others looked numb. One young man briefly glanced toward the crowd. For a moment, his gaze met Lucius's. Then the guards pushed the prisoners onward. The moment lasted seconds, yet it stayed with him, because history often reduces people to categories: prisoners, suspects, victims, citizens, enemies. In reality, they remain individuals, each with fears, each with families, each with stories. That night Rome seemed quieter than usual. The rebuilding continued. The investigations continued. The accusations continued. Life continued. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The city no longer felt confident. The city no longer felt invincible. The Great Fire had burned more than buildings. It had burned away illusions. And in the months ahead, the consequences would become even more visible, because Lucius was about to witness another dark reality of ancient Rome, one that existed long before the fire, one that had helped build the empire itself, a system so vast that millions lived and died within it. The system of slavery. As the months passed, the scars of the Great Fire slowly became part of Rome's landscape. New walls rose where ruins had stood. Construction crews filled the streets from dawn until dusk. Stonecutters shaped blocks beneath the sun. Carpenters hammered endlessly. Engineers measured roads and foundations. The city was rebuilding itself, but rebuilding required labor, enormous amounts of labor, and much of that labor came from people who had little choice in the matter. One morning, Lucius received instructions from Senator Gaius to inspect records connected to several estates outside Rome. The task seemed simple: a few days of travel, several inventories, a stack of contracts. Nothing unusual, yet the assignment would expose him to one of the darkest foundations of Roman society, a foundation so common that many citizens barely thought about it. Slavery. The journey began shortly after sunrise. Accompanied by a steward and several guards, Lucius traveled south through the countryside. The farther they moved from Rome, the more agricultural estates appeared. Some were modest, others stretched across the landscape as far as the eye could see. Olive groves, vineyards, wheat fields, livestock enclosures, massive properties controlled by wealthy owners. The prosperity looked impressive from a distance. The reality became more complicated up close. Late on the second day, they arrived at one of Senator Gaius's largest estates. The steward seemed proud of the property. "Very productive land," he remarked. "It appears so." The steward smiled. "The owner has invested wisely." Lucius soon understood what that meant. Hundreds of workers labored across the estate. Most were slaves. Some harvested crops. Others repaired fences. Others transported supplies. Others worked in workshops, producing goods for sale. Every part of the estate depended upon them. Without their labor, the entire operation would collapse. The scale astonished Lucius. In Rome, he saw slaves every day. Household servants, teachers, porters, craftsmen, but seeing hundreds gathered in one place revealed something different. Slavery was not merely part of the economy. It was one of its foundations. That afternoon, Lucius began reviewing inventories. The records listed livestock, equipment, storage containers, tools, and slaves. The names appeared alongside property values. A skilled blacksmith, a trained accountant, a shepherd, a carpenter, a cook, each assigned a monetary figure. Lucius paused repeatedly while reading. No matter how familiar slavery became, reducing human beings to inventory entries remained unsettling. The steward noticed his expression. "You disapprove." Lucius chose his words carefully. "I was only reading." The steward laughed. A wise answer. The conversation ended there. Some opinions were best kept private. That evening, Lucius walked through part of the estate before sunset. Workers were returning from the fields. Most appeared exhausted. Many carried visible signs of hard labor: sunburned skin, calloused hands, old injuries. The daily workload was relentless. One elderly slave caught Lucius's attention. The man moved slowly. A limp affected his left leg. Despite this, he continued carrying equipment alongside younger workers. Lucius approached. "How long have you been here?" The old man seemed surprised by the question. 26 years. 26 years. Nearly 3 decades. Longer than Lucius had been alive. "Were you born here?" The man shook his head. "No." "Where then?" The answer came after a brief pause. "Gaul." Lucius nodded. The old man offered no further details. Perhaps he preferred silence. Perhaps the memories hurt. Perhaps he had told the story too many times. Across the empire, countless enslaved people shared similar experiences. Captured during wars, sold through trade networks, born into slavery, punished into slavery. The paths differed. The destination remained the same. Loss of freedom, loss of control, loss of choice. That night, Lucius struggled to sleep. The estate felt quiet, too quiet. Unlike Rome, where noise never truly disappeared, the countryside settled into near silence after dark. Only distant insects and occasional animal sounds interrupted the stillness. The silence encouraged reflection, and reflection raised uncomfortable questions. Rome celebrated military victories constantly. Triumphs filled streets. Monuments commemorated conquests. Histories praised generals. Yet every victory produced captives. Every conquest created new slaves. The connection often disappeared from official celebrations, but it remained real, very real. The next morning, Lucius accompanied the estate manager during inspections. The manager took obvious pride in efficiency, productivity, profitability. He discussed workers the same way merchants discussed cargo. This group harvested well. That group required supervision. Those workers produced better results. Everything centered around output. Human considerations appeared secondary. At one point, they passed a young slave who had injured his hand. The wound looked painful. The manager barely glanced at it. "He'll return tomorrow. What if he can't work?" The manager shrugged. "Then someone else will." The answer revealed the harsh logic underlying large estates. Individuals mattered less than the system. One worker could be replaced. The harvest could not. Later that day, Lucius reviewed disciplinary records. The documents listed punishments for various offenses: attempted escape, theft, disobedience, fighting. Some punishments seemed severe. Others seemed brutal. The estate considered them necessary. Fear maintained order, at least according to those in charge. That evening, while eating with several supervisors, Lucius listened to conversations about runaway slaves. The topic emerged frequently. Escape remained a constant concern. Some fugitives were eventually recaptured. Others vanished. The possibility worried owners enormously. One supervisor described a recent incident. They nearly reached the coast. What happened? Someone recognized them. And then the supervisor smiled coldly. They came back. Nobody asked what occurred afterward. The implication was obvious. The next day brought a chance encounter that stayed with Lucius for years. While organizing records in a storage building, he met a woman named Livia. Unlike most field workers, she served as a clerk. She could read, write, calculate, skills that made her valuable. During a brief conversation, Lucius learned she had been educated before becoming enslaved. Her father had been a merchant in a provincial town. Debt destroyed the family. Circumstances worsened. Eventually, she was sold. The story sounded painfully ordinary, not because it happened often to everyone, because misfortune could alter lives with shocking speed. "What do you miss most?" Lucius asked. Livia thought for several moments. Finally, she answered, "Choice." The simplicity of the response struck him. Not wealth, not comfort. Choice, the ability to decide where to go, what to do, how to live. Many free Romans took such freedoms for granted. Those without them rarely did. When the assignment finally ended, Lucius returned to Rome, carrying completed records. The city appeared busier than ever. Construction continued everywhere. New projects transformed entire districts. Life moved forward relentlessly. Yet the countryside remained in his thoughts, particularly the old slave from Gaul. 26 years. 26 years belonging to someone else. 26 years without control over his own future. Rome's wealth looked different now. The elegant villas, the public baths, the grand banquets, the monuments. Behind them stood millions of hours of labor, much of it performed by people who never chose the work. The realization proved difficult to ignore. Several days after his return, Lucius visited the bathhouse. There he encountered the veteran once again. The old soldier listened quietly as Lucius described the estate. When the story ended, the veteran stared into the steaming water. Most people see the empire from the top. What do you mean? The emperors, the senators, the victories. Lucius nodded. The veteran continued. Very few look underneath. For several moments silence lingered between them. Then the old soldier spoke one final sentence. The empire was built by people history rarely remembers. Lucius could not disagree, because increasingly he realized that Rome's greatest monuments told only part of the story. The darker part existed elsewhere, in fields, in mines, in workshops, in crowded neighborhoods, in forgotten lives, and soon he would discover perhaps the most brutal example of all, a place where human beings were consumed for profit at a shocking rate, a place many Romans preferred not to discuss. The mines were not spoken about in polite conversation, even in Rome, where brutality could sometimes be treated casually. There were subjects people avoided. The mines belonged to that category. Lucius first heard of them again in passing, while copying legal correspondence for Senator Gaius. A document mentioned labor allocations in the province of Hispania. A short line stood out. Mining operations require increased replacement workforce. Replacement workforce. The phrase stayed in his mind longer than expected. That evening, he asked the veteran about it. They met near a quiet fountain after dusk. The old soldier listened, then nodded slowly. So you've started noticing that part of the empire. What part? The part that breaks people. Lucius frowned. Are the mines really that bad? The veteran didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the darkened city. When I served in Spain, he said finally, I saw mines carved into mountains like wounds. Lucius remained silent. The veteran continued. Men went in healthy. Many never came out the same. The words were simple, but their weight was heavy. Over the following weeks, Lucius encountered more references. Official reports, tax records, supply documents. Every mention of mining carried the same quiet implication. High output, high demand, high turnover. It became impossible to ignore. Rome's economy depended not only on agriculture and trade, but also on raw extraction. Silver, gold, iron, copper, materials that fueled currency, weapons, construction, and luxury. But the cost of extracting them was rarely recorded in detail. One morning, Lucius was assigned to a company an official reviewing provincial accounts tied to mining revenues. The journey would take him far from Rome, further than he had ever traveled before. They left at dawn. The roads stretched outward like veins from the capital. At first, the landscape remained familiar. Fields, villages, roadside shrines. But gradually, things changed. Settlements became smaller. Terrain became harsher. Hills turned into rocky stretches. Forests grew denser in places, more barren in others. By the second week of travel, the air itself felt different. Drier, heavier, more still. Eventually, they reached a provincial administrative center in Hispania. From there, escorts guided them toward the mining region. As they approached, Lucius began noticing unusual details. Military presence increased. Guard posts lined the roads. Travelers were questioned more frequently. The steward accompanying him explained casually, "Security is necessary." For what? To prevent escapes. Lucius said nothing, but he understood. Escape from where exactly? The answer revealed itself soon enough. The mines were not a single location. They were an entire network carved into mountains and deep underground tunnels. At first glance, the landscape looked almost empty. Then he saw the entrances, dark openings in the rock, heavy wooden gates, iron fittings, guard towers positioned above. The air grew colder near the site, and quieter, too quiet. A supervisor met them at the main entrance. His tone was professional, efficient, detached. "Production has increased this quarter," he reported. "Good," the official replied. "We still require additional manpower. We'll send replacements." Again that word. Replacements. Lucius followed the group inside. What he saw remained with him permanently. The tunnels descended into darkness. Torches lined the walls. The air grew thick and stale. Dust filled every breath. Sound changed underground. Muted, distant, broken. Workers moved slowly through narrow passages, carrying tools and broken rock. Most were chained in small groups. Some worked in silence. Others showed signs of exhaustion, so severe it bordered on collapse. The official beside Lucius spoke matter-of-factly. "Output depends on discipline." Lucius glanced at him. "What happens if they cannot keep pace?" The answer came without hesitation. "They are replaced." Again, that word. But here it meant something far more disturbing. Deeper inside the mine, they reached a chamber where ore was being extracted. Slaves hammered stone continuously. Hours blended together. Day and night mattered little underground. Time was measured only by shifts and exhaustion. A worker collapsed nearby. For a moment, no one reacted. Then two overseers approached. They checked him briefly. One nodded. The body was dragged aside. Work resumed immediately. No pause, no acknowledgement. Lucius felt something tighten in his chest. Not shock, recognition, because this system was not improvised. It was organized, efficient, sustained. The mines operated like machines, but the machine required fuel, human fuel. Later, he learned more details from a junior clerk stationed at the site. The man spoke quietly during a break. Most don't last long here. Why? The clerk hesitated. Accidents. Lucius understood what that meant. Collapse, injury, disease, exhaustion, starvation. Silence followed. After a moment, Lucius asked another question. Where do the workers come from? The clerk lowered his voice. War captives, convicts, those sold by debt. Some are born here. Born here. The words felt especially heavy. A life beginning underground, ending underground, with no memory of anything else. As days passed, Lucius observed more. Punishments were frequent, conditions harsh, supervision constant, escape nearly impossible. The geography itself acted as a barrier. Mountains, distance, isolation. Even if someone fled, where would they go? One evening, Lucius stood near a narrow tunnel entrance, watching workers return from deep shafts. Their faces were covered in dust, eyes dull, bodies moving mechanically. He noticed a young boy among them, perhaps 13. The boy carried a small hammer, almost as large as his arm. Lucius approached the overseer. That child shouldn't be here. The overseer barely looked up. He works like the others. He's a child. The overseer shrugged. Then he learns quickly. The conversation ended there. In the mines, morality seemed suspended. Only productivity mattered. Only output. Only extraction. That night, Lucius could not sleep. The lodging provided to officials sat above ground, far from the tunnels. Yet even here, he imagined the sound of hammering, echoing endlessly, as though the mountain itself was breathing. The veteran's words returned to him. The part that breaks people. Now he understood more clearly. This was not metaphor. It was structure, a system designed around endurance of labor until collapse. The next morning, Lucius reviewed financial records connected to the mine. The numbers were extraordinary. Silver output, tax revenue, profit margins. The empire benefited enormously. And yet, nowhere in the documents was there mention of the cost in human terms. Only productivity, only value, only extraction. At one point, he asked the senior official overseeing the records a question. Does anyone ever leave here? The official looked at him as though the question was unusual. Some are transferred, and the rest. A pause, then a simple answer. They are no longer useful. That sentence stayed with Lucius longer than anything else he had witnessed, because it reduced human existence to a single condition: usefulness. By the end of their inspection, the officials prepared to return to Rome. The journey back felt different, heavier, quieter, Lucius spent most of it thinking about everything he had seen. The fields, the households, the estates, and now the mines. Each layer revealed another form of labor, hidden beneath Roman prosperity. Each layer depended upon control. As Rome expanded, so did its need for systems that could extract resources and maintain order. And those systems often carried costs that never appeared in official celebrations. When Lucius finally returned to the city, Rome appeared unchanged on the surface. The same streets, the same markets, the same noise, but he no longer saw it the same way. Every structure now carried invisible weight. Every luxury suggested unseen effort. Every convenience suggested hidden suffering somewhere else. That night, as he walked through Subura, he passed a group of children playing in the street. Their laughter echoed between buildings. For a brief moment, the scene felt normal. Then he remembered the mines, and the illusion broke, because somewhere beneath empires, beneath cities, beneath monuments, there were always places where human beings disappeared into systems designed to consume them. And Rome was no exception. It was only better at hiding it. The winter arrived quietly that year. No dramatic announcement, no sudden shift, just a slow cooling of the air, a thinning of daylight, and a city that seemed to breathe a little more slowly than before. Rome still functioned. It always did. Markets opened, bathhouses filled with steam, courts debated law, ships arrived at the docks carrying grain, oil, and wine from across the empire. On the surface, nothing suggested collapse, but Lucius no longer trusted surfaces. Not after the fire, not after the investigations, not after the estates, not after the mines. What he had seen over the past year had changed something fundamental in him. Not belief in Rome, but belief in what Rome truly was. One evening, he walked alone through the Forum. As dusk settled over the city, statues of long-dead generals stood motionless in fading light. Their names were carved into stone, their victories preserved, their failures forgotten. Nearby, merchants packed up their stalls. A group of senators passed by in conversation, speaking calmly about grain supplies and provincial taxes. Life continued, as if nothing beneath it had ever shifted. But Lucius noticed what others ignored: the exhaustion in workers' faces, the silence in public spaces, the carefulness in conversations, the invisible habit of restraint. Rome had not changed overnight. It had been revealing itself slowly, piece by piece, layer by layer. That night, Lucius visited the veteran for what would be their final conversation. The old soldier sat near a small fire in a quiet courtyard. He looked older than before, more tired, yet his eyes remained steady. "I heard you went north," the veteran said. "I did." Silence followed. Then Lucius spoke. "I think I understand now." The veteran nodded slightly. Do you? Lucius hesitated. I think Rome is not what I was taught. The veteran gave a faint, almost sad smile. No empire ever is. Lucius sat beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. At last, Lucius asked the question that had been forming for months. Does it ever get easier to see it? The veteran looked into the flames. No. A pause. But you stop pretending you didn't see it. That answer settled heavily between them. The truth about Rome was not hidden in a single secret. It was distributed across thousands of ordinary realities. A shoemaker evicted, a slave sold, a worker replaced, a miner consumed, a city rebuilt from ash. Each event seemed small on its own. Together they formed something vast, something enduring, something built not only from stone and law, but from human endurance stretched beyond comfort. Lucius stood as the night deepened. From the courtyard, he could see the distant glow of Rome, the capital of the world, the center of power, the symbol of civilization. But now he also saw the cost behind it, not as abstract history, but as lived experience, as countless lives that never appeared in monuments, as voices that never reached official records, as suffering that never entered triumphal songs. Before leaving, he turned back to the veteran one last time. Why tell me all this? He asked. The old soldier looked up. Because someone has to remember what the statues don't show. Lucius nodded slowly. Then he walked away. Days later, life in Rome continued as always. Emperors ruled, senators debated, markets traded. Children grew up unaware of the full weight of the system around them. The empire would continue for centuries in one form or another, but Lucius's understanding of it would never return to what it once was. He had seen too much beneath the surface. The fire had shown him how quickly order could become chaos. The investigations had shown him how easily fear could reshape truth. The estates had shown him how prosperity depended on invisible labor. And the mines had shown him the final layer, a system that consumed human lives with quiet efficiency. Years later, when Lucius began writing his own accounts of Rome, he did not begin with emperors or battles. He began with ordinary people, because he had learned something most official histories never fully admit. Empires are not built only by those who command them. They are built by those who endure them. And when people remember Rome, they often remember its greatness, its roads, its architecture, its power, its legends. But Lucius remembered something else, the silence beneath it all, the silence of those who worked, suffered, and disappeared without ever being recorded as part of the story. And that, more than any conquest or monument, was the true dark side of ancient Rome, not hidden, just rarely spoken about, until someone finally decided to look closely enough to see it. And once seen, it It could not be unseen again.